Get Out is an American horror film released in the year 2017. The plot of the film follows an African-American man, Chris Washington, who decides to visit his white girlfriend's family during a weekend getaway. Things become overwhelming for Chris when he uncovers a series of increasingly disturbing secrets that lead him to a truth that he could never have imagined. The film opens with a young black man walking down a quiet street in the middle of the night. All of a sudden, a car stops next to him. To avoid encountering the creeper, the man starts walking in the opposite direction. However, he ends up getting knocked out by the white creeper. After the man loses consciousness, he's thrown in the trunk of the car and taken away. The scene cuts to a young African-American photographer named Chris Washington, leading a happy life with his white Caucasian girlfriend, Rose Armitage, in Brooklyn, New York. The duo have reached the meet the parents milestone of dating, so Rose wants to introduce Chris to her parents. Although Chris is preparing for a weekend getaway upstate with her parents, he feels anxious. Out of curiosity, he asks Rose if she's ever told her family about their interracial relationship. Rose is head over heels for Chris and assures him that her parents are not racist and that they would love him. The duo finally set out for upstate New York. On their way, Rose berates Chris for his bad smoking habit and throws his cigarettes out the window. Chris then calls his best friend Rod Williams, who's a TSA officer, and appreciates him for watching his dog for the weekend. After the phone call, Rose starts teasing Chris, but all of a sudden, they hit a deer that appears in front of the car out of nowhere. Both Chris and Rose are petrified by the accident. After a while, the cops arrive to deal with the situation. Rose starts an argument when the cop asks Chris for his ID, even though he wasn't driving. Rose is upset at the fact that the police officer is racially profiling Chris. After the situation is handled, the couple resumes their journey, and Chris is pleased with Rose for standing up for him. Finally, they reach the destination, and Rose's parents are overjoyed to see their daughter. Chris is also warmly welcomed by Rose's father, Dean, who's a neurosurgeon, and her mother, Missy, who's a psychiatrist. Rose tells her parents about the deer accident, and her father can't stop making confusing remarks about deer and appreciating Rose for killing one. Rose feels embarrassed and tries to stop her father from making such comments. Dean then takes Chris along to give him the house tour. While giving the tour, he keeps making belittling comments about black people. Moreover, Chris is a bit surprised to see that they have black house servants, Georgina and Walter. Later, while having some family time together, Missy asks Chris about his parents, and it turns out that Chris spent most of his life alone as his father wasn't really in the picture and his mother died when he was 11 years old. Dean suddenly suspects that Chris might be a smoker and inquires him about it. Rose is annoyed by her parents' judgmental behavior and keeps asking them to stop. Dean then offers Chris to seek help from Missy, who can cure his smoking addiction through hypnosis, but Chris doesn't show much interest in it. He then informs Rose and Chris about the big annual get-together that their family's holding on the weekend, and Rose is bummed to hear about it. Just then, the housemaid Georgina serves them drinks and mistakenly overfills Chris's glass. Both the house servants seem lost and traumatized, and Chris can't help but feel weirded out by their strange behavior. At the dinner table, Rose's brother Jeremy reveals her teenage secrets, embarrassing Rose. After getting drunk, he tries to show Chris his karate moves but is kicked out of the room by his parents. Before going to bed, Rose keeps blabbering about her family's strange behavior towards Chris and apologizes to him on behalf of them. However, Chris does not feel bad and reads the family's overly accommodating behavior as nervous attempts to deal with their daughter's interracial relationship. At night, he's unable to sleep, so he walks out of the room to get some air. He goes to the front yard to smoke a cigarette and is freaked out to see Walter rushing towards him out of nowhere. When he turns back, he is again petrified to see Georgina standing at the kitchen door smiling at him weirdly. Scared, he walks back into the house only to find Missy waiting for him in her therapy room. Upon her insistence, Chris comes inside and starts chatting with her. Missy tries to convince him into a hypnotherapy session to cure his smoking addiction. While he's in the trance, she starts questioning him about where he was when his mother died. Chris breaks into tears while confessing that his mother was killed in a hit and run when he was a child and that he feels responsible for her death as he waited too long to call for help. He suddenly feels paralyzed, and just then, Missy sinks him into a void that she calls the sunken place, a place where he feels helpless, where he can only witness the outside world but can't control his body and mind. The next day, he wakes up abruptly and thinks that the session with Missy was a dream. He goes into the woods to click some photographs. On his way back, he tries to sneak up on Georgina through his camera, but he fails to do so. Outside the house, he meets Walter, who mentions their encounter last night and also about his session with Missy, leaving Chris puzzled. Chris tells Rose that her mother hypnotized him as he no longer has a desire to smoke. Moreover, he tells her about his weird dream where he was in a hole and felt paralyzed. Chris also mentions Walter's hostile behavior towards him and thinks that Walter maybe likes Rose. But Rose thinks it's stupid and makes fun of it, leaving Chris speechless. Just then, the family's guests start arriving at the house. Rose introduces her rich white relatives to Chris, who expresses unusual admiration for Chris's physique. Amidst the party, Chris spots a black gentleman named Logan King and approaches him. Chris is confused to see Logan's strange behavior and his much older white wife, who's twice his age. After a while, Chris meets an art dealer named Jim Hudson, who's well acquainted with Chris's photography. Jim went blind in his old age, and ever since, he uses an assistant who explains to him the details of the art. Chris gets exhausted from the party and goes upstairs to unwind. Weirdly, everyone at the party goes quiet after Chris leaves. He goes into his room only to find his phone unplugged and drained of battery. Rose comes to find him, and Chris tells him that he suspects Georgina unplugged his phone. He suspects that Georgina feels jealous as he's dating Rose. Rose again makes fun of it and leaves. While charging his phone, Chris calls Rod and informs him about all of the strange things happening in the house, and finding out that Chris got hypnotized, Rod freaks out and warns him that the family can hypnotize him into doing all sorts of illegal things. When Chris tells him that all the black people he met seem disoriented, Rod suspects that they are getting hypnotized. Suddenly, Georgina appears in the room and apologizes to Chris for accidentally unplugging his phone. In her strange behavior, she breaks into tears while praising the Armitage's attitude and generosity towards her. Chris then gets back to the party. Dean introduces him to more of his guests who question Chris about his African American experience. Chris feels incapable of expressing himself and diverts the question to Logan so he can answer it. In the meantime, Chris tries to photograph Logan discreetly, but unfortunately, his flash goes off. All of a sudden, Logan's nose starts bleeding. He becomes hysterical and starts attacking Chris while shouting at him to get out. Everyone calms him down, and later Dean explains that Logan had a seizure which created anxiety and triggered aggression in him. Missy brings back Logan from her therapy room, and he's back to the way he was before. He apologizes to Chris for frightening him with his weird behavior, and then he leaves the party with his old wife. Seeing Chris freaked out, Rose takes him away from the party for a bit. Chris tells Rose that he can't stop thinking about weird scenarios and thinks that her mother got into his head. Rose is unable to understand anything and resents when Chris tells her that he wants to leave. In the meantime, Dean is seen playing bingo with the guests while having a giant-sized portrait of Chris next to him, and Jim is happy with it. On the other hand, while sitting next to the lake, Chris tells Rose about the incident of his mother's death and that he deeply regrets not calling 911 while his mother was lying on the side of the road bleeding. He does not want to lose Rose and asks her to go back with him. The two of them kiss and set off to the house to pack their stuff. Chris sends Logan's picture to Rod, who recognizes him as Andre Hayworth, whom he knew before. When Chris tells Rod that Logan seemed different and is married to a woman 30 years older than him, Rod suspects that he's being hypnotized and used as a slave. Just then, Chris's phone battery runs out and he starts packing quickly to get out of there. While packing, he discovers a red box hidden in Rose's room and opens it only to find photos of Rose in prior relationships with several black partners. And surprisingly, she also has pictures with Walter and Georgina. Chris feels frightened as Rose claimed that she had never had a relationship with a black person. Without uttering a single word, he tries to leave the house but is blocked by Jeremy. Chris keeps asking Rose to give him the keys, but all of a sudden, Rose turns on him and groups with her family. Chris attacks Jeremy, but just then Missy uses a trigger that she implanted during hypnosis, knocking him out. Chris starts sinking deep into the sunken place, and Rose claims to him that he was one of her favorites. The next day, Rod keeps calling Chris, but he's unable to reach him. At night, he randomly Googles Andre Hayworth, only to discover that he is a missing man in Brooklyn. On the other hand, Chris wakes up strapped to a chair in a basement and tries to free himself, but to no avail. Just then, he's shown a video documentary called Behold, the Coagula. In the documentary, Rose's grandfather, Roman, explains that the family relocates their brains into others' bodies, granting them chosen physical characteristics and a twisted form of immortality. After the documentary is over, Chris is again knocked out after seeing the same hypnotizing visuals. On the other hand, Rod tries to file a missing person complaint about Chris, but listening to his story, the police officer makes fun of it, dismissing his claims. Later, he calls Rose to inquire about Chris, but quickly suspects that Rose is lying to him, that Chris returned back 2 days ago. Meanwhile, Chris wakes up and is connected to Jim through a TV, who tells him about the 3 phases of the brain transplantation procedure. First is hypnosis, second is mental preparation, and third is transplantation. Moreover, he elucidates that the host's consciousness remains mindful in the sunken place but powerless, meaning that after the transplantation will take place, Chris will still be able to see everything but won't have any power, and the people who came to the gathering were bidding to buy Chris's body. It turns out that Jim won to take over Chris's body, but he doesn't care about Chris's race. All he wants is Chris's eyesight to see through. After Jim's conversation is over, Chris is again hypnotized and knocked out. On the other hand, Dean starts the brain transplantation surgery on Jim by anesthetizing him. Jeremy is asked to bring Chris to the operation room for surgery. However, when he unties the hypnotized Chris, it turns out that Chris blocked the hypnosis trigger by plugging his ears with cotton stuffing pulled from the chair. Chris starts smashing a solid ball on Jeremy's head, causing his head to bleed. He then appears in the operating room and stabs Dean with the antlers of a deer mount. In his agony, Dean stumbles over a candle, setting the entire operating room on fire along with Jim. As Chris walks upstairs, he destroys Missy's cup and spoon that she uses for hypnotherapy and stabs her to death. He then heads towards the door to leave but is attacked by Jeremy. However, Chris takes him down and stomps him to death. Meanwhile, Rose is in her room having her earplugs on and unaware of what is going on down in the house. After killing Jeremy, Chris quickly gets into a car and starts driving. He calls 911 to call for an emergency, but all of a sudden, he hits Georgina, who gets knocked unconscious. Chris feels bad for her and decides to carry her into the car. Just then, Rose becomes alerted to the situation and loads a rifle to shoot Chris. However, Chris leaves with Georgina, who suddenly wakes up, and it turns out that she's possessed by Rose's grandmother, Mary Ann. She starts attacking Chris for destroying her family, and while struggling to fight her, Chris crashes the car onto a tree. In the crash, Georgina is killed. Chris quickly comes out of the car and is pursued by Rose, who keeps firing her rifle, and asks Walter, who's possessed by her grandfather Roman, to grab Chris. When Walter tries to overpower him, Chris uses the flash on his phone to sort of deactivate Roman. This allows Walter to regain control over his body, so he asks Rose to lend him the rifle. Rose hands him the rifle thinking that he will kill Chris, but instead he shoots her in the stomach and then shoots himself to death because he can no longer bear to be in the sunken place. While bleeding, Rose tries to manipulate Chris by telling him that she loves him, but Chris starts strangling her. However, he is unable to kill her, so Rose smiles at him maniacally. Suddenly, a police siren starts approaching and Chris raises his hands to surrender. However, the driver turns out to be Rod. Chris walks towards him and he drives him away, leaving Rose bleeding to death. The movie has a rating of 7.7 on IMDb. The budget of this movie was around $4.5 million, and at the box office it earned $255.4 million. I hope you all liked this video. If yes, then make sure to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more movie recaps.